Well, Yemen is one of the world's poorest countries, and it is, quite frankly, straining to deal with COVID-19. The British Red Cross estimates the fatality rate from the virus is 26%. That means more than 1 in 4 people who contract the virus in Yemen will die. Only half of health facilities are functioning, and they are lacking basic equipment like masks and gloves, let alone the oxygen and other essentials to treat the very worst of the virus. Let's bring in Alexander Matthew. He's an executive director for the British Red Cross. He joins me now live from London. Your colleagues are on the ground. Sadly, a number of your colleagues have lost their lives in Yemen over the past couple of years. What is it that your colleagues can specifically tell us about just how challenged the place is at this point?
Well, the crisis in Yemen is not just about the crisis of COVID-19. It's the challenge of COVID-19 meeting a multitude of other crises, many of which actually predate the conflict. So already it was the most water-scarce country in the world. Half of the population lived on less than $2 a day. Then you have 5 years of conflict, which, as you correctly say, basically means that half the health structure is no longer functioning. Many of the roads and bridges are damaged, so you can't move around the country in the way that you could before. People have lost their jobs, or they haven't been paid for 4 or 5 years, including doctors, nurses, and water engineers, which means you don't have access to clean drinking water. The combination of those factors is what makes COVID-19 so dangerous for Yemen.
Yeah, and of those who contract the virus, 1 in 4 die. That is a number that is horrifying. I mean, should not be allowed anywhere in the world. This COVID-19 is bad enough, but statistics like that are just awful. The United Nations humanitarian chief has warned that Yemen will, and I quote Mark Lowcock here, fall off the cliff without massive financial support. And he says rising coronavirus cases just add to the existing problems of what is this war-torn country. Echoing what you have just explained, what is your message today?
Well, a number of things need to happen. I mean, first, there needs to be emergency humanitarian aid in Yemen, food, medical supplies, and equipment for hospitals and medical centers. That is number 1. 2, the ports need to facilitate that. 70% of imports in Yemen go through the single port of Al Hudaydah. It's only functioning at under 50%. You need to make sure these ports are able to bring in the essential medical supplies. 3, you need to be able to access the parts of the country most in need. It's a mountainous country. As I said before, many of the roads and bridges are destroyed. It's also run by different factions, and all of them need to give access to neutral and impartial organizations like the International Committee of the Red Cross or the Yemeni Red Crescent. 4, and this might sound controversial, you need to pay the doctors, nurses, and water engineers. They haven't been paid for 4 or 5 years, and unless they're being paid, these critical systems will not function. 5, I would say that every party into the conflict needs to adhere to international humanitarian law and make sure that medical facilities are not targeted, and make sure that civilians and non-combatants are protected. Ultimately, Becky, you need a political solution for durable peace. But those first 5 things that facilitate humanitarian aid and humanitarian access, they're critical.
And it was interesting, because as you listed those, I'm listening to them and thinking to myself, you know, we are quite far removed from actually getting any of what you have just suggested done. And that is, you know, Yemen, you know, the crux of the Yemeni problem, isn't it? That you know, the virtual pledging conference, I think there were sort of 31 donors, you know, over $1 billion in pledges. It's something like half what's needed. You know, why do you think it is that as much as the international community appears to try hard on occasion to get Yemen back into the headlines and to get some financial support for the place, it just doesn't seem to happen?
Well, suppose there may be multiple reasons for that. It might not be everybody's priority, but I would say that when I was there last year, over 10 million people were receiving essential food assistance each month. I mean, that's a huge operation. It's not enough. And there were 6.5 million people who were desperately in need of assistance and not getting it. So I don't want to say that was a good situation, but it is worse at the moment.
Sure.
So the World Food Programme is reducing its food rations when we actually need more. The World Health Organization is reducing the amount of money it can pay for doctors and nurses just as we need more. So the fact that it's reducing at this time really is quite tragic. So I suppose I would just urge everybody to recognize this is the world's biggest humanitarian crisis. Lives depend on humanitarian assistance. There's many crises in the world, Becky, but there's only a few where people will die if assistance doesn't come in urgently. This is one of them. So I really hope it will be prioritized.
Yeah, no, you're making your point very, very clear today. I mean, I think it was Mark Lowcock again pointing out that so many of those who live in the country rely on remittances from elsewhere, and those remittances, that's physical cash that people can actually use in the country, have sort of dried up during COVID. And once again, you know, it's this sort of COVID overarching sort of story which seems to have provided such a double whammy to so many places that were already struggling.
Yeah, I think it's probably a triple whammy. It's the existing crises. It's the crises that have been exacerbated by COVID-19. And you mentioned a critical one for Yemen. Remittances are down by 80%. And given the high levels of unemployment, many state civil servants are not being paid. Remittances were an absolute lifeline. Plus, actually, to make it even worse in Yemen, the main revenue for the country, oil, is also not bringing in the revenues it was. So that's the sort of consequence of the pandemic. And then you've got the virus itself. So it's like three things hitting at once.